of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legends fade to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the third by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the mountains of mist. The wind was not the beginning. There was neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, but it was a beginning. The Eye of the World, the first book in the legendary Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan and finished by Brandon Sanderson. What's going on, guys? I'm Frankie Reynolds. Welcome to another episode of Is It Worth It?, where I do all the hard work for you and let you know which books are worth reading. Today's episode is one I've been really excited to do since first starting this program on Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time. I want to add a quick disclaimer there. The Wheel of Time is one of the largest, if not the largest, fantasy series ever written. It's over 12,000 pages long, 14 books in length, not including a prequel. I have only read 3 of them so far, so this is solely a review focused on the very first book in the series, The Eye of the World. When I eventually finish the series, I will do a comprehensive review of The Wheel of Time, but for today's purposes, I wanted to give you guys some insight into the first novel and let you guys know whether or not this is one you should read, especially with the anticipation of the upcoming TV series through Amazon. Amazon's The Wheel of Time is one of the most anticipated television shows we've seen since Game of Thrones ended. Everyone's trying to find the next big fantasy television project. Netflix explored this last year with the release of the first season of The Witcher, which I will get to a review of the first novel in that series sooner rather than later. Amazon is trying their hand at it with The Wheel of Time and also a reboot / prequel story related to The Lord of the Rings. A lot of cool stuff in the fantasy landscape coming out here on television in the near future. So today I want to give you guys the heads up as to whether or not getting into The Wheel of Time before it comes out is worth it. There's a lot you can say about The Eye of the World, which means there's a lot you can say about a 14-book series. I think that when you introduce what at the time was meant to be a 12-book series, that was of course until Robert Jordan's untimely death, and Brandon Sanderson had to come in and finish things off and ended up turning that last novel into 3. You have to consider the amount of world building that is going to take and the difficulties that can come for an author trying to do it. There's certain information that you have to withhold. There's certain information that you cannot info dump, but nevertheless, it still has to get out there to your audience. The Eye of the World is a perfect example of how to balance all of this effectively and in an engaging way. Let me put it this way. The story never slows for the sake of slowing down. Oh, hello, Lal. The puppy wants to say hi. We just gonna chill? You gonna be part of the review now? Okay. As I said, the story never slows for the sake of simply giving information to readers because he feels like they need to get it at that time. Instead, everything we need to know is presented in really adventurous ways. A lot of this is done because Jordan elects to do something pretty bold for when this was released, and that is tell this through a limited third-person perspective and multiple point of view characters. One thing we have to remember when we talk about The Wheel of Time is how stories were told back in the day. In the 1980s, a lot of fiction was told through third-person omniscient storytelling. It's much easier to build a world like this when you have an all-knowing narrator who can give you information in at the drop of the hat. Jordan took a really big risk by trying to tell this in a third-person limited perspective from multiple point of views when he first released this novel, but man, it pays off. A lot of authors actually consider Jordan the master of point of view storytelling, including Brandon Sanderson, George R.R. Martin. I mean, these are big names in the fantasy genre now. They owe a lot of their style to inspirations they pulled from his writing. So really, without The Wheel of Time, I don't think we ever would have gotten stories like A Game of Thrones, the Stormlight Archive, Mistborn. There's so many fantasy series out there that are based with the same storytelling styles that Jordan, I don't want to say came up with, but that he took a risk in utilizing. I also want to point out that The Eye of the World does something else that a lot of fantasy stories don't do, even modern fantasy stories, and that is getting right to the action. I mean, within the first 50 pages, we're doing stuff, and it's important stuff. It involves swordplay, it involves violence. I mean, we are getting right to the point very early on in this story without unnecessary exposition. You gotta credit Jordan for that again, because you gotta remember, back in the day, this was not the norm. Now we know, yeah, you should show, don't tell when you can, all kind of stuff, but it holds up even now. And something else that holds up is the magic system. It's so unique, and it is so relevant in today's modern world that you almost think that Jordan wrote this book in the future and released it in the past. It's that relevant to today's society. You really can't help but have a sense of awe when you read The Wheel of Time with an understanding that this came out in the 1980s and we're now living in the 2020s. I applaud Jordan so much for the risks he took. I thank him for it, and this really is in a lot of ways the granddaddy of all fantasy, and I include the Lord of the Rings series when I say that. Now, that's not to say that Robert Jordan's fantasy is unique in the sense that it differs from Tolkien's story. In fact, a lot of readers will be irritated and turned off by the fact that Jordan seems to pull a little bit too much of his inspiration from the Lord of the Rings. Emond's Field is essentially the Shire. Trollocs are orcs. Murdrals are ringwraiths. Randall Thor, our protagonist in a lot of ways, shares some character traits to Frodo. And Moraine and Lan are this story's version of your Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. The Eye of the World's also an adventure story that jumps from location to location, kind of like a modern day video game, and it's very similar in that regard to The Hobbit. So a lot of people are going to read this story, especially fans of The Lord of the Rings, and think that Jordan's a copycat for going down that route, and I can't necessarily blame them for it. Something else to keep in mind if you're considering diving into The Wheel of Time. This is a big series, gigantic, so you're going to spend a lot of time reading Robert Jordan's style, and his style is very repetitive. I mean this in two different ways. For one, his prose, the words he uses are repetitive. This kind of irks me a little bit. I love variety in writing. I think that there are interesting ways that storytellers can say things, and that's kind of what their job is as a storyteller. Robert Jordan doesn't do this. He just says things as simply as he can, and it's probably for the betterment at times because it's already a big book, and if he tried to use a different vocabulary, a more embellished vocabulary, we're probably looking at something that's another 200 plus pages. But there's still something to be said for the times that he continually uses the same descriptor in the same paragraph. Secondly, Jordan is also repetitive when we consider the fact that he continually reminds us of things that have happened. I get it. I fall victim to this as a writer too. When we're trying to tell stories from various points of views, it's very tempting to start the next chapter for a specific character out with a little recap of what happened last time, especially if we haven't been with them for a while. However, we don't need to do this when we last saw that character 15 pages ago. I don't need the recap, it's still fresh in my head. We get this a lot with Robert Jordan in The Eye of the World. Kind of makes the novel a little bit long-winded. It's going to be a turnoff for some readers. I also want to make a note on the characters. They're all different, they're very interesting, and again, when we look back at the time when this was produced, it was a great endeavor to tell a story with so many different characters from so many different point of views. Talk about an undertaking. That said, the characters do some things that I don't necessarily think that I would have done when I was their age. They don't really handle the situation the same way that somebody in a modern day and age might. I didn't live in the 1980s, so I don't know if my views on this are limited because of that. I just think that they process information and situations very differently, and it makes it a little hard to connect with them until we understand their motivations from a plot perspective, not necessarily from a reader to writer connection. let me put it this way. Jordan has this kind of weird YA and adult fantasy blend going on here that I'm not sure would fly with a publisher nowadays. I think that he would be asked to change some things were this a modern publication. But we also need to remember that YA did not exist back then. So that's definitely one of the reasons for this. But we are still reading this in a modern age, and you need to be aware of it before you go into the story. Lastly, before we get to whether or not this story is actually worth it, I want to introduce a new segment to the channel, and that is the Audible check-in. If you guys don't know what Audible is, it is a listening network through Amazon that allows you to listen to your books on the go. You can be in the car, you can be working out, you can be doing dishes. I mean, whatever it is, you have the ability to read more when you are busy with other things that don't necessarily allow you to sit down and put your eyes on a page. I'm a huge fan of Audible. I don't do it as much now because I don't commute to work, but I still am a big fan of it, especially their whisper sync function where you can listen to a book on the go, and when you get home, pick it back up on your Kindle exactly where you left off. It's a really cool feature. And when I read a novel, at least partially from an Audible narrator, I want to let you guys know whether or not that's worth it. In this case, yes. I say that unequivocally because Michael Kramer and Kate Redding are two of the best Audible narrators in the business. They've been doing it forever. They have dozens, scores, hundreds of different voices that they use for these guys. True voice actors that can make a scene feel fresh and new no matter what they're reading. There's a lot of characters in the Wheel of Time. Again, I cannot say that enough. And every single one of them has a unique voice, a unique tone, and a unique style that these narrators bring to the table. There's no confusion with how they read. It's really like you're listening to a cinematic production from a radio perspective when you listen to the Wheel of Time. So, drum roll. Really bad. Is it worth it? Yes for some, no for others. Let me explain. If you are tired of the Tolkien tropes and you want something completely fresh, which there's plenty of it out there, I don't think this is for you. There's not enough new stuff here to turn you on to this type of story if that bothers you. Also, 14 books and a prequel is really long. Again, I've said that like 5 times so far, but it's true, and it's really important that you know that heading into this. I've heard from a lot of people that you need to have read at least the first 3 novels before you make a decision on this series. That's what I did, and that's what I waited to do until I gave you this review. But 3 books at 600 to 700 pages each, that's the equivalent of almost 2,000 pages worth of writing. That's a lot of time invested for some people just to make a decision on whether a series is worth it. And then if you decide it is worth it, you still have another 10,000 pages to go. It might just be too long for some people is what I'm trying to say. But if you're looking for a new fantasy epic that's as classic as it is sheerly great in scope, give it a shot. It's got a stellar magic system, one of the coolest magic systems I have seen in fantasy, and again, it is very modern, it's very relevant to today's society, and it's a monumental achievement in world building and in characterization. And if you just want to get an idea of what inspired some of the modern greats to pick up a pen, turn the computer on, and get started with their now classic series, you almost got to go back to where it started, and that's either going to be with The Lord of the Rings or, in a lot of cases, The Wheel of Time. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Is It Worth It for The Eye of the World. Remember, this is going to be a huge Amazon series in the next year or two, COVID pending. I really think that they are going for the gusto on this. They are trying to make this the next Game of Thrones, and they have the source material to do it. If you're one of those people that has to read the book before the show, get on it now. And if you're not, hey, maybe watch the first season and see if the story interests you, if the characters interest you. I have heard the television series is going to take a little bit of a different approach than the books do. I don't want to say what because that could be a little spoilery, but maybe it's worth watching the first season to see if these people interest you, and if they are, then pick up your copy. Thanks again. Have an awesome week. Keep reading.